do you want? What do you think? What do you want? I want the latest games anywhere. What do you want? I want the sounds that curl my hair.
Video games are the latest craze to sweep the country and most of the world, too. Millions of people are addicted to hours of gazing at electronic images on game screens in arcades and in their own homes. What makes video games so popular? Well, we search for an answer as we begin a special series on Video Fever, games people play.
In 1981, Americans popped in between $5 and $9 billion worth of quarters and tokens into the slots of arcade video games. There is so much money to be made that the manufacturers can ill afford to ignore trends in the marketplace.
The familiar din of the video arcade is fading out. Business has dropped in half over the past year, and companies like Atari claim losses of more than $350 million. The slick, swift-paced space games are taking a nosedive, and analysts predict a crunch in the industry by Christmas. The craze has definitely peaked.
The video game industry was dead to begin with, dead as a doornail. Due to a slew of poor video game titles released in the home market, as well as other factors, there was a huge crisis of consumer confidence in video games in the beginning of 1983. Seemingly overnight, the demand for video games dropped to virtually zero, causing many game companies' stock price to fall. With so many companies flooding the game market at once, many companies immediately folded. Retailers, unable to return product to companies that went bankrupt, had little choice but to heavily discount items to get them off store shelves. This made a bad situation worse by flooding the market with cheap, but very poorly made video games. Many who bought these games, even at discounted rates, felt very cheated, and by the end of 1983, the public opinion was that video games were just a fad and the craze was over. Companies that would not survive the video game crash include Coleco, Mattel, GCE, and yes, even Atari. As their stock prices kept plummeting, Warner Communications decided to sell off Atari, splitting it into two different companies. From 1983 until the fall of 1985, there would be no new home video game consoles released with any measure of success. However, video games did live on during this time period thanks to another revolution that was taking place in the early 1980s. Despite what many video game industry analysts were thinking at the time, video games did not die, however they were transported into home computers. Many families in the 1980s started adopting computers, primarily as a tool to help with things like word processing and household finances, but another major selling point was, unlike video game consoles, these machines were seen as educational. As many parents started buying home computers for their kids, video game developers saw an opportunity to provide games on a platform that the kids already had. Computer games would become the next big business in video games. However, this is only the story in North America. In other parts of the world, the video game crash really didn't occur. For example, in Japan, the video game industry was just taking off. Companies like Nintendo and Sega were having a lot of success selling their home video game consoles in the Japanese market. Nintendo ended up being the first company to push the idea of selling home consoles in North America. They had been trying to find a partner to distribute their Famicom in the United States, and they were even in talks with Atari at the time of the video game crash, but due to Atari's collapse and eventual sale, this deal never went through, prompting Nintendo to take matters into their own hands. Nintendo set up a headquarters in North America and showcased their new idea called the Nintendo Advanced Video System at the Summer CES show in 1984. But Nintendo failed to gain any sort of interest in the console. The problem was that many people still believed that video game consoles were a fad that had come and gone, and that there would be no profits made in trying to revive that industry. Nintendo, not really willing to give up on the market, spent the next year redesigning their console, disguising it as a toy rather than a game console. In the fall of 1985, Nintendo launched their Nintendo Entertainment System. And although the console was not a blockbuster hit, its initial sales were strong enough to turn the heads of many people who thought the game industry was dead. The following year, Sega would release their Master System, and Atari would bring their latest console back from the dead to compete in the newly revitalized video game market. It is here where the 8-bit war officially begins. Hello everyone, welcome to a very special episode of Player One Start. Today we're going to talk about the Atari 7800, the Sega Master System, and the Nintendo Entertainment System, and we're going to have them face off to see which one was better. Before we get too far into it, if this is your first time here, there were actually 3 videos that preceded this one, and I'm going to leave links to those down in the description. If you want to watch those before or after this video, the choice is up to you. Also, if you haven't clicked that like and subscribe button yet, please remember to do so before the end of this video. But oh my gosh, what a dramatic opening to set the stage for the 8-bit war. Atari was the dominating force here in North America, from the introduction of the video computer system in 1977 to the crash of the video game market in 1983. Once the market had crashed, it was the opinion of almost everyone at the time that video games were a fad that had come and gone. And it was during this time that a lot of the top video game developers of the time actually folded and went under. The ones that survived, though, had done so by moving on to home computers. Companies like Activision and Electronic Arts decided that they would move into a platform that people most likely had in their homes, and that would have been a system like the Commodore 64 or the Apple II, and even including the IBM PC market. You know, computers at this time were still actually reserved mostly to computer hobbyists, tech geeks, and the like. Some families actually started purchasing computers because they were seen as something that was educational for their kids. And keep in mind that most of these machines would actually remain offline or not connected to the internet. The modern web was actually still years away. And this leads me to a question that I am often asked of younger people, and that is, what did you do with computers back in the day before the internet? Well, the answer is, we play computer games. From 1984 until 1985, most of the games that came out would actually do so on home computers, and anyone attempting to bring a new video game console to market was met with large criticism. However, that didn't stop Nintendo. It actually took a couple of years for Nintendo to convince people that it was worthy to invest in video games. They went to extreme lengths with retailers to even stock their system at first. And even though they weren't an initial blockbuster success, the fact that Nintendo wasn't necessarily a clear and utter failure turned the heads of other video game companies and changed the minds of many people that video games were just a fad. It turns out people will still play video games if they're good. So since I've already covered each of these consoles in their own video, I'm going to go ahead and just have each video game company showcase their own with the ads they released. So let's go ahead and take a look.
What will the future bring from Nintendo? More hits like The Legend of Zelda. Sports hits like ice hockey. Nintendo has the most video game hits like Hogan's Alley and Donkey Kong Classics, and more like Excite Bike and RC Pro-Am. And you can play them only on the Nintendo Entertainment System. Now you're playing with power.
Sega challenges you with the ultimate video game. The Sega Master System, with twice as much memory as any other video game. Advanced video technology like scrolling backgrounds, graphics in 64 colors, digital sounds, and light phasers. And you can add to the excitement with sports pads, control sticks, and the first video games ever in 3D.
Sega's the one.
The Sega Master System. The challenge will always be there.
In 1986, we also introduced the next generation of video game systems, the new 7800, and it was an immediate smash hit. Early in 87, new super game titles, like one-on-one basketball, Winter Games, and Sky Fox will be released to take advantage of the 7800's great graphics, lifelike animation, and superb sound effects. Plus, there will be other hot new titles from such top software companies as Activision, Electronic Arts, Rotorbund, and Epix. And at under $100, the 7800 is one of the best home entertainment values in the world. That's why we're telling millions of consumers that Atari has reinvented the video game.
So there we have it, the Nintendo, the Sega, and the Atari. But actually, there is a fourth contender if you really consider it. Remember how we talked about Atari being pulled in different directions, even being split in half? Well, Atari actually released another game console, believe it or not, that was intended to compete with the Nintendo Entertainment System. It's actually based on their Atari 8-bit computer line, and it's called the Atari XE Game System. Let's go ahead and take a quick look.
This is the Nintendo Video Game System. It plays only cartridge games. This is the new Atari XE system. It plays cartridge and disc-based games. Disc drive sold separately, and only Atari comes with a real joystick. Both have guns, but only Atari comes with the target game Bug Hunt. Nintendo has a toy robot, but only Atari gives you a keyboard for playing advanced computer games. It even comes with the amazing Flight Simulator 2 cartridge. The new Atari XE Video Game System. Unbeatable.
So the main advantage of the Atari XE game system was that it could play all of the old Atari 8-bit computer games that came out before it, even those on disc, not just on cartridge. This was also during the time that they had re-released the Atari 2600 as the Junior. So that means that Atari was actually supporting 3 different consoles at the same time by 1987. However, I have left the XE game system out of the 8-bit, or at least for now, because it actually has more to do with their Atari computer line, and I'll talk about that in a future video. But alright, we've set the stage, now let's start comparing the consoles. It's hard to know even where to begin when comparing such classic consoles from the 1980s. It could be best to start where it all started for me. This is my original Nintendo Entertainment System that I got in 1988. This console has a box look and sharp corners that only the 1980s could provide. On the front we have Nintendo Entertainment System printed in red, right above the power and reset buttons. All of that is opposite of the 2 controller ports on the side. Turning around to the side of the console, you can see the hookups for red audio and yellow composite video. On the back, you can see the RF out port, as well as the channel selector, which I always set to channel 3. Both of those reside next to the barrel jack power port for the AC adapter. This console's cool and unique tray cartridge loading system is also its biggest design flaw. However, this is not the only Nintendo Entertainment System that Nintendo put out. Here is the NES2, also known as the top loader. The console is noticeably slimmer and removed the defective tray mechanism. Power and reset are now loaded on top of the console, but still right next to the controller ports. Flipping the console around to the back, gone are the composite audio and video hookups, and instead we're left with only the RF out. Overall, this console's low-profile design gives it a nice sleek look and is a welcome improvement to the original system. Next we move on to the Sega Master System. This console has a sleek black look, and instead of a boxy shape, it actually looks more like a pyramid with its sharp angled top. On the front of the console is the power button, followed by 2 controller ports, and an alternate cartridge slot known as the Sega card port. Underneath the cartridge port, highlighted in red, are what appear to be instructions on how to operate the console. This gives the console more of a futuristic look. On the back of the console, you will see an RF out next to an AC power adapter jack. Again, my RF out is set to channel 3. However, you can also get AV out via a DIN connector that was standard on a lot of computers of the 1980s. Sega was the first of the major video game companies of the 1980s to release a revised console. This was dubbed the Master System 2. Released in 1990, the sharp angled edges are now smoothed out to give it more of a rounded appearance. The cartridge port also, instead of having a double flip gate that pushes down when you put in a cartridge, it actually has a gate that you have to manually open to insert a cartridge. This version of the console also removed the card port, which was not widely used, to reduce cost. And like the NES top loader, it removed the AV composite out, leaving only an RF jack on the back. Both of these consoles have telltale signs of the era they were designed in, the original 1985 console having the sharp edges, and the Master System 2 having rounded corners of the 90s. Next, we have the Atari 7800 Pro system. It may be interesting to note that this was the first console actually to have a commercial release, so its design predates both the Nintendo and the Sega Master System. The fact that this console was initially designed to compete with the Colecovision appears to be evident in its design, as it has an embossed metal strip that is seated just below the cartridge port, as well as a rainbow-colored strip that was also evident on the Colecovision in its logo. This console, however, has a mixture of both worlds of having sharp edges on the sides and a rounded base in the front. And that is where the power and pause button resides. There is an LED power indicator to tell when the console is turned on. On the other side is your select and reset button. Turning the console onto the back, you will see the proprietary power adapter connection, and you will not find an RF connection on my console. However, that is the only way this console was initially made. My console has been modded to have a composite video and analog audio out. So when evaluating this console design, I will go ahead and leave that out. I do enjoy this console's design, especially compared with the Atari 2600, however it does appear dated when sitting next to the other two consoles, as it reminds me more of a ColecoVision and early 80s era rather than the later 1980s. As with previous reviews when I compare consoles, I reached out to the Twitter community to see which console you all felt looked better, and here are the results of that poll. But does this sway my decision, and which console do I think looks better by design? This was a tough decision, but ultimately I believe that the Sega Master System is designed the best. I do prefer the black plastic case of the Master System as compared to the white and gray box of the Nintendo, and I like how the cartridge port stands out at the top of a pyramid as opposed to the Atari 7800. I will state this opinion is mostly subjective, and I know that other people will have different opinions than me, but for the purposes of this review, the Sega Master System wins in this category.
Alright, so at this point I'm actually only going on console aesthetics, basically how things look. And I realize that this is a very subjective opinion. Everyone that you talk to is going to have a different opinion about which console looks better and why they feel that way. Next, let's go ahead and take a look at a piece of hardware that provides a bit more functionality.
When evaluating controller design, there are actually two facets you have to look at. First, there's the appearance, and next is how the controller feels and handles. Taking a look at the controller for the Nintendo Entertainment System, you can see how its color scheme matches the original console. The controller also shares the same boxy shape of the console. The controller is laid out in a logical design that almost every game console since has mimicked. You have the directional pad or D-pad located on the left of the controller, with a start and select button in the middle, and your action buttons located on the right. As with the redesign of this console, the Nintendo Entertainment System controller also got a brand new design. Again, the color scheme was altered to match the color scheme of the console, as the gray and black are now gone. The controller also loses its boxy shape and has more rounded corners. In fact, as both sides of the controller are rounded, it has earned the nickname the dog bone controller, based on this shape. The directional pad remains largely unchanged, however the start and select buttons now have an angle, and the A and B button also have a slight angle similar to the Super Nintendo controller. With this new design, the controller also feels much more comfortable in your hands than the boxy controller of the original console. However, from my experience, playing with this controller does take away from a little bit of the nostalgia of playing with the older box controller. The controller of the Sega Master System also shares its aesthetic with the original Sega Master System console. Although it does have that box shape, the angles are actually not as sharply cut and are a bit more rounded than the Nintendo controller, and thus feels a bit more comfortable in your hand, although this controller is a bit smaller. That's partially due to the fact that there are 2 less buttons on this controller. The Master System, being released after the Nintendo, did copy the directional pad, but took a different approach to avoid infringing on or paying license to Nintendo's patent on the directional pad. It does make it a bit more difficult to tell which direction you're pointing your directional pad without actually looking at it. However, the ridges for up, down, left, and right, and even the diagonal directions help out a lot. The action buttons are simply labeled 1 and 2, with one of those buttons also duplicating as your start button. The pause button is actually located directly on the console on both versions. Unlike the Nintendo redesign, Sega did not redesign their controller when releasing the Master System 2. And lastly, we'll take a look at the Atari 7800 controller. Again, this controller looks a little bit dated, actually looking like it would compete with something like the ColecoVision or a console that was released before the Nintendo Entertainment System. I will say, out of all the controllers that I've used for an Atari console, this one actually feels the most comfortable in my hand. However, it does require both of my hands to operate, one for holding the controller and operating the action buttons, and another for actually controlling the joystick. When this controller was shipped overseas, it actually came with a different controller, more stylized after the Nintendo Entertainment System controller. Since those are rare and hard to find here in the US, I actually ended up getting this custom controller that is identical to the Nintendo Entertainment System controller, and this became my preferred way to play Atari 7800 games. You could also use a Sega Genesis controller on this console. However, I have heard that you can accidentally fry out your console by pressing the start button, as it links to a pin that is usually used for regulating power on the 7800. For most games, I did enjoy using this controller better. However, there are some games where you might prefer a joystick rather than a directional pad. That choice is up to you. So out of all these controllers, which one did I find the best? Again, here are the results of my Twitter poll asking this question. Well, I have to go with the Nintendo Entertainment System controller on this one. And if I were to narrow it down even further, I would choose the Dogbone controller for the NES too. I give this to Nintendo for creating the directional pad, which made gaming accessible to a large audience. And on every controller, even to this day, there is still a directional pad on the left and action buttons on the right, along with a start button somewhere in the middle.
Alright, so in my opinion, controller design can make or break a console, as I've stated in my previous videos. However, my main reasoning for awarding this to Nintendo is the fact that they were the first to invent the directional pad. Although it wasn't originally designed for the Nintendo Entertainment System, it was actually designed for one of their Game & Watch games. Their controller layout would set the standard for what a controller should look like up until the present day. So because of its iconic status and effect on every video game console since, not just including Nintendo's own brand, I have to award this to Nintendo. Well, that actually wraps up for this part. In the next part, we're going to take a look at technical specifications of these consoles, including graphics and sound. Stay tuned for that part coming out next week, and if it's already posted, it'll be at the end of this video. As always, if you did like this video, please be sure to click that like button, and if you haven't already, please remember to click that subscribe button and the bell icon to be notified when I make future posts in this series. Also, let me know what you guys thought about today's video in the comments below. I'd really like to see what your guys' thoughts are on these consoles. And I'm also interested to see which console you guys believe will win the 8-bit war.
If you like this video and you'd like to help out with future projects on this channel, please consider supporting me on Patreon. Again, I want to thank you guys so much for watching. I'll see you next time.